Ladies and gentlemen, no punchy intro this time because we are talking about something that's a little unsexy, but is going to be very important in your journey, and that is niche discovery. So let me just go ahead and I'll bore you with any of the normal blabbering we do before we get into modules. As I said, ladies and gentlemen, this module is about niche discovery. Now, in today's teaching, we are going to go over defining a niche, a tale of two agency owners, marketing message and offer, the 3 green lights to move forward with a niche, how the current socioeconomic climate affects niche selection, becoming engrossed in your niche research plug and play, closing the disconnect between you and your niche, and climb to the top of the mountain and how to stay there. So ladies and gentlemen, what is a niche? Quite simply, a niche is a segment of the market. Now, that can be a specific industry. That could even be a type of client, right? You could work with brands that only, for example, have an ethos of, kind of like what we do at GreatAgency.com, where we take a portion of our profits and use that for some sort of social cause. So that could, funny enough, that could actually be a niche. A niche could even be some sort of ideal client. Now, you don't want it too fragmented, right? Because you could have, for example, you could have a restaurant, that does this sort of social cause thing, and then an e-commerce business. That's too fragmented. But a niche that you could have, for example, is, e-commerce businesses that have this sort of social component to them as well, right? When you marry those two up, then you're really starting to dial in and you're really starting to have a very compelling message in terms of who is it that you're looking for. Now, you might be wondering, Iman, why niche down when you could just have multiple? Well, it comes down to the narrow and deep approach compared to the wide and flat. And ladies and gentlemen, really what the narrow and deep approach is that you're a specialist. And this is why specialty tax advisors get paid the most. This is why specialty doctors get paid the most. Literally any sort of service provider you can think of, when they specialize in one industry and they're truly the best of the best, because here's the thing, when you're working with a generalist compared to a specialist, it's not really like, it's not even like 50% better, which is still massive. It's thousands of percents better, many multiples better, right? Because the specialist has just done so much more work in that field. And that's why for your clients, it's so important for you to specialize, not even just in terms of market message, but just in terms of your own personal fulfillment from running this business. When you know that you've seen some shit and you know that you have navigated some stormy seas for previous clients, that gives you a lot of confidence going forward with your future clients. Now let's talk about the tale of 2 agency owners. So we have one agency owner, right? And they decide, why niche down when I could just target 4 or 5 different niches? And the issue with that is they struggle to get paid well from clients because, as I said, the clients just view them as a generalist and not a specialist. And because of that, they don't make specialist kind of money. And let's talk about other aspects of the agency because their operations are a shambles. It's like every single new client they have to bring on, it's a totally different process, right? They can't plug and play, they can't SOP, they can't really streamline and bring their agency together in a cohesive manner. Because as I said, the way that you execute is very different between these various niches. Now let's talk about the other agency owner who decides to listen to me. They niche down, they specialize with one specific industry, and for that reason, they command high fees, and they do it with full confidence. When they state their price, they don't squirm, they don't second guess themselves, because they know if you want to work with the best of the best in this specific industry, then we're your go-to. And the reason that is because, let alone in terms of having the right market message, and actually in the first place, having a market message you can go out and take to your niche, they have amazing industry-specific case studies. And then when a client comes on board, everything is streamlined, right? Because at the end of the day, we are still in the service-based business, right? We run a service, okay? But so for that reason, we can never fully productize our service, but we damn well can get as close as humanly possible. And really 80% of the job is just slotting new clients into this predetermined and pre-built machine. And that's why, for the most part, if you're niche down, getting clients results is really just a walk in the park. Now let's talk about niche marketing message and offer. Now, this is very important to remember, guys, and this is available as a printout down below. A person who tries to appeal to all will stand out to none. And I quoted myself there, but I'm sure someone has said that before. So yeah, apologies to whoever actually said it. But really what you need to understand here is that your marketing message and your offer, and I'll explain the difference between the two, is probably the most important aspect of your outreach. Because as I said, it's the same thing in real life. A person who tries to appeal to all will really stand out to no one. So you need to strategically disqualify yourself. And let me just say that again. You need to strategically disqualify yourself with the people who are not your ideal target client. And ladies and gentlemen, this is where your level of thinking needs to be, right? Generalist versus specialist. A lot less cogs turning, but outputting at a much higher velocity. Now, for the first 6 months, I'm gonna go ahead and give you a hall pass. Okay, this is what you can look like in the first 6 months. Okay, you can do what we refer to in this industry as niche hop. Okay, you can bounce between a few different niches and just see what's out there, and that I have no issue with whatsoever. But after 6 months, you gotta lock in on one niche. Before we actually go ahead and decide on a niche, there's 3 things that need to be a green light in order for us to actually, qualify that niche as worthy of going for. Now, the first one is this client making $5,000 a month or more? So for example, if you're working with, I don't know, like imagine you're working with like a cello instructors, that really wouldn't be a good niche because, for the most part, they're not really usually making over $5,000 a month or more. Same thing with, 99% of personal trainers. I have seen people in the past work with personal trainers and it has worked, but I would steer away from, I even worked with them a lot back in 2017. But as a general rule, they need to be making at least $5,000 a month or more. And especially if they're like brick and mortar business or an e-commerce business, they need to be making substantially more than that. Next question is, are you passionate about the niche, right? If you're passionate about the niche, it's not an absolute must, okay? But it definitely is a big, big factor because you'll speak the language. And, let's really just talk about why being passionate about the niche is important. First things first, you'll be excited to deliver results for them, okay? Because it's like, you kind of almost have a bit like it's, for me, even with a lot of the clients we work with, like for me, I'll start talking about their business and, I can literally think of one sales call I had yesterday and it's like, I get excited just almost helping them build their business with them, right? Because like, I love the inner workings of their specific business. 80% of our clients are e-commerce businesses, 20% are education companies. The sales call I had yesterday was with an education company and like, I get fired up, right, talking about their business because for me, it's I love online education. That's probably the thing I'm most passionate about. Then second, the client will know you have a deeper reason / passion for his business. And I think that's really, really important, right? When you're working with clients and as I said, it's not an absolute must, okay? But when the client knows that like, hey, this person actually like has an affinity towards this industry. Like they have and I've seen it. I'll give you a perfect example, right? I was talking to someone and they were thinking of what niche to go into and they were thinking of going into, working with dentists. And I asked why. And they go, it's because I had really terrible confidence growing up. And my dentist, managed to fix my smile. It did take a couple years, but, now I have incredible teeth. And in fact, people compliment me all the time on my teeth. So that is immensely powerful. If you just tell that story to every single dental client you work with, as I said, it's so powerful. Now, I will say, for me, when it comes to, for example, e-commerce businesses, which is the bulk of our business at this point, I don't really have any deeper why. I don't really have any deep meaning behind working with them. Whereas, when we used to be working like 70, 80% with info product businesses, they knew, I explained to them, especially, in most of the cases, they came in from ad in a funnel, so that they didn't necessarily know about gradiency or like why education is important to me or like the fact that I dropped out of high school, but like online education and self-education was like kind of my way to where I am today, right? So, I was able to explain that and I was able to explain the schools in Nepal and I was, they could really sense that I had a deeper purpose and a deeper passion when I'm talking about how happy it makes me that there's now a platform for people who have actually done it to teach it, right? So as I said, this is one benefit and it doesn't, at the moment we're killing it with e-commerce businesses and I don't really have any sort of deeper meaning or deeper why. So it's not 100% necessary, but it definitely is something in your arsenal that you can use. And last thing is you'll probably already speak their language, right? Like it'll be very easy for you to understand the terminology and like even just like little insider words that like you only understand if you're in that industry or just like in every industry, every market, there's even just like inside jokes. Right? So, these are really the 3 biggest benefits. And this actually brings us to question number 3. And question number 3 is, do you understand the mechanics of the niche? Right? And this is a non-negotiable, or at least you need to be able to do it once you get into the niche. Now, as you are starting to learn about the niche, you could go very blindly into something if you guys want to. Like if you were just like, hey, you know what? That niche looks cool. For the most part, I don't recommend it. I recommend you go for one that you're either passionate about or one that you have a competitive advantage in, right? So let's say, for example, your dad was a real estate agent. Well, hey, that's a massive competitive advantage right there. Or let's say your brother works at a car dealership. Hey, that's a massive competitive advantage because like you actually understand the ins and outs of the business, right? For me, that's actually why I targeted infoprog businesses and education companies, because I was running one. So I was like, oh, like this is, why am I working with gyms? Like this, I realized this back in early 2018. I'm like, why am I working with gyms? Like, you know, because with that one, I used the model of, oh, it's something I'm passionate about. I understand the terminology, this, that. And then I decided, hey, is there something I have a competitive advantage in? And you know, for me, that was I was already running a education company. So once you ask yourself those two questions, and those are really the two most important questions you should ask yourself when picking a niche. And once you've done that, that really gives you a good compass as to where to go next. Now, you may have, there may not be an answer to either of those. You know, there may not be a niche where you have any competitive advantage in, and there may not be a niche where you're particularly passionate about it outside of the agency world. And if that's the case, then that is totally fine, right? Because we can learn and we're going to soak up as much knowledge as we can about this specific niche. So as I said, those three things really need to be a green light for you to move forward. And a big one, as I said, is that $5,000 a month. Like, are they making $5,000 a month? And I'm talking in that case, usually if it's a service-based business. Obviously, if it's a brick and mortar, they need to be making way more than that. And ladies and gentlemen, I hear all the time, local lead gen is dead, right? I hear everyone say e-commerce, you got to do e-commerce, this, that. I think I've already mentioned this publicly, but you know, once the craziness of AN finishes and I can move on to the next thing, I think maybe I even mentioned this in the last module. Once this is all done, I'm actually starting a sister local lead gen agency. Why? Because I think I could be making just the same amount as my e-commerce agency with substantially less work and substantially less headache. Because you know, even though my niche is e-commerce, you need to understand that every single business is different. Like, e-commerce is a funny one because it's not actually technically a niche. It's more of a umbrella, right, of a company. Like, it's a company type. So just understand, if you want to work with local businesses, that's fine. The biggest thing I'll say is just work with high ticket local businesses, right? So we're talking dentists, real estate agents, insurance companies, car dealerships. You know, the list really does go on and on. Really, the ones you want to avoid are the cafes, the restaurants, the personal trainers, potentially even the gyms, unless there's a really good USP or there's really good like sort of bundle packages that they do. So that way there's a flip over of revenue very, very quickly. So it's not that local lead gen is dead. It's just you want to avoid low ticket local lead gen, which, by the way, same thing applies to like the infoprog space. Like, working with education companies, is a great niche to work with. It's just you don't want to be working with low ticket infoprog or education companies. So it's like, it's not really about online versus offline. It's just about low ticket, right? Like, just in general, low ticket sucks, and it's really hard because most of the time you're breaking even or going in the hole on the front end, but that's the whole business model, because then you make all the money on the back end. And but sometimes that's very hard to explain to a client, right? Or clients, like, very few business owners know how to do that, break even on the front end or even lose a bit of money on the front end to make crazy amounts of money on the back end. So as I said, really apart from that, it's just the two questions. Is there something that I'm particularly passionate about and I know a lot about already, or is there something where I have a competitive advantage? Ask yourself those two questions, and if the answer is no to both of those, then that is really where you can just start to just go into exploration mode. Because the world's really your oyster, and you can pick a few different niches and see what comes to you. So here's some examples of common/profitable niches. Gyms, as I said, gyms, very specific ones, so bear that in mind. Gyms, dentists, e-commerce, real estate agents, coaches/consultants, cosmetic surgeons, that's a very high ticket one. Restaurants I need to remove. Restaurants I do not recommend. Now, this is ones that people have done, but I just stay away from restaurants, trust me. Car dealerships, great one. Accountants, another great one. Pest control, once again, can be a very high ticket service. Watch dealers, once again, obviously a very high ticket service. Chiropractors, once again, high ticket service, and something where like you'll come in and they'll be like, okay, like this is, you'll come in for initial consultation and they'll be like, okay, this will be a 12-week process. When you work with a chiropractor, everyone knows you don't come in once. Like, it's a actual commitment, right? You're going to commit, and then hopefully you're going to walk away with a lot less back pain. So chiropractor is another great one. Hair salons, funnily enough, a lot of the like extensions and stuff like that, like getting into the hundreds and hundreds of dollars. Like, some of these hair salons, like Man, like being a girl is expensive. Insurance, another great one. Solar niche, another great one. Automotive repair shop, once again, a lot of high ticket stuff that they offer. Infoprog businesses, right? So slightly different from coaches to consultants. You know, coaches to consultants, that's usually like a high ticket program, or maybe even a done with you. Infoprog business, obviously just course without usually any additional support. And personal trainers, which once again I need to remove unless you've got a personal trainer who only sells people on these like bundles or packages. But yeah, if I were you, the two from here that I really should have removed is personal trainers and restaurants. Next is understand